parties shouldn't be disadvantaged just because they start out small and start out poor. We want to equalize the political playing field, and we want to ensure that parties campaign to protect people's interests, and parties ensure that people's interests are protected when they are elected. Our side defines running costs and electoral campaigning funds as the funds that people need to pay their campaign managers, funds needed to pay for advertisements on print media, social media and television, also for other things like on-the-ground campaigning, because people need to set up electoral campaigns and people need to go for door-to-door campaigning, and all of these cost a significant amount. This is our policy for today. We will provide equal funding for every single political party that assembles and comes forward to the government to ask for funding. The political parties that will be given this funding will include those parties that follows the regulations of each individual country, and that is why we're not imposing a standard. For example, some countries require a party to be able to govern consistently one constituency, one constituency or one district within the country. Or for example, in Germany, they ban neo-Nazi parties, and that's why these parties won't be given funding. In other areas, maybe the slightly more hardline parties, like in Greece, the Golden Dawn, will still be given funding because they fall within the country's regulations. We think we are perfectly fine with that. Third clause, we will ban all sorts of corporate funding and political donations for these parties because we think they don't level the playing field and it's politically toxic for the discourse that happens within the country. Fourth, we will include more media exposure for every single party. Like, we will expand the American political debates to not just include the Republicans and Democrats, but also other independents and also other smaller parties, because we think they give valuable insight. We will include airtime and more television time for every single other candidate and other political party that wants to represent the people. The criteria for this debate is very simple. Which side better protects choice? Which side better protects democracy? And which side best protects the interests of the people? Our side will forward three arguments today. First of all, that we equalize the political playing field. Second of all, that we protect people's interests. And third of all, my second speaker will tell you how we increase political engagement towards the disenfranchised. First substantive on how we best equalize the political playing field. First of all, let's establish why this is important to begin with. We think that in a democracy, people make their own choice. It is by virtue of their own agency to choose the best government. They choose from a range of parties which best represents their views, their best solutions, and this is the best approximation for the best government that will come up later, after the election. More importantly, we think it can only happen when everyone starts on an equal footing and an equal playing field. Because only when everyone gets equal airtime and largely equal exposure that there is no lopsided advantage to any other party that is always bigger than the rest of the parties. This allows people to deliver a better choice. But beyond that, why doesn't this happen in the status quo? Because first of all, we have three reasons for this. First of all, larger parties have systemic advantages because they receive large amounts of corporate funding and funding from lobbyists in Congress. There is also huge startup costs for parties and huge startup costs for media advertising. There is also a lot of airtime for large parties because they dominate political discourse due to all of their intrinsic structural incentives to be large. But beyond that, our second reason is that this interest and this advantage given to larger parties is entrenched over time. We present this as a vicious cycle because the more exposure you get, the more money you get, you tend to win in a district every single time. You become the face of that district. People associate your face and your party with the election that happens there. And that's why smaller parties hardly can overcome the incumbent advantage. It overcomes the smaller parties' advantage every single time because they can hardly win in that district. That is why their interests are entrenched over time. For example, Gary Johnson, the Libertarian Party candidate for the 2012 presidential elections, barely 5%, less than 5% of the nation knew about him. And this was because he had little or no funding as compared to Barack Obama or Mitt Romney. This shows how smaller parties are drowned out by the systematic advantages that larger parties enjoy. But last of all, we'll prove to you why governments should fund this in order to ensure that the political playing field is equalized. We have three very good reasons for this. First of all, we think this is a public good that most governments tend to fund, just like any other thing, like equal compulsory primary education, which the government funds. Because yes, it's a public good, we think it's good that everyone deserves to make an equal political choice to ensure that they choose the most optimal government in the future. Second of all, we think it actualizes the right to political assembly. We think the right to political assembly is meaningless if not for the fact that they are allowed to even go into the political playing field and ensure that you can assemble a party and potentially win an election. We want to ensure that things like that, hold on for a moment, sir, things like financial barriers are removed because we think it's unfair that just because people are poor that they cannot run for elections. Yes.
If you ban all funding other than that to the state, parties are never going to be able to reach out and make everyone in the nation politically aware of what's going on.
Sir, I'm not sure what your reasoning is behind that, because we don't think it shows at all. Once we give funding to every single person, they will make sure they maximize the funding to ensure they reach out to every single person instead of pandering to corporate interests, as I'll prove later on. But the third good reason we have is that the government has an incentive and comparatively larger resources to pander to every single person. Because the government generally likes goods like that. The government wants to protect the welfare of the people. The government also generally has a lot more funds than any other entity within the state. And we think the government will put all of these funds to a good cause. And that's why we want the government to fund this. This is why we think the government is best placed in this situation to equalize the political playing field and protect the choice of the people in a democracy. Second argument I'm going to forward to you today is about how we ensure that parties are now accountable to the people, because the government funding ensures that we protect the interests of the people. In the status quo, the largest parties are funded, no thank you, by lobbyists and corporations. As a result, they now need to protect the interests of corporations because now they are beholden to them. Corporations don't give money to you with no strings attached. They give you money with many strings attached. For example, in the United States, the tobacco lobby is massive, NRA, National Rifle Association, is massive, and these cause a lot of problems. The first problem is that while parties try to protect corporate interests, generally, corporate interests are misaligned with public interests.
Point of information,
yes.
What you fail to recognize is that under the status quo, parties which cater to the most number of people in your society are the ones that get the most funding, such as Obama and his Democrats.
Sir, we don't think so at all, because clearly when there are only two major parties in the United States to choose, people don't really get a real choice. They are forced to choose between these two parties, and we don't think the numbers of voting, especially the low voter turnout, is representative of a true democracy at all. But beyond that, corporations generally try to earn more money and profit at the expense of the public. Like in Monsanto is a massive lobby in the US Congress, but they generally produce such expensive seeds and crops that they drive farmers to suicide. Clearly, the two interests are not in line. The end goal for parties therefore means that they try as far as possible to cater to rich lobbyists and corporations, and Congress generally passes laws in favor of corporations. We think this becomes a competition for more funds because funds are so important to win. Obama won the 2008 election just because he had more funds. All they do is to create the perception of pandering to people, but they don't actually pander to the people. Obama promised in 2008 that he would clamp down on the too big to fail banks, but in the end he protected them. And we think this principally is wrong for a few reasons. That we don't think they should be beholden to the people, we don't think they should be beholden to the corporations. In the end, we think that the government best ensures that when you give them money, you are beholden to the state, because the state is a neutral actor and the state best protects every single person. We don't think that corporations should hold people at the mercy of every single person. For all these reasons, our side best protects the people, and our side should take this debate.
Not be decided by government dollars. You should stand with a side that allows for better governance, better representation. Opposition. What is the stance of the side opposition? We have 4 clauses in government policy. There will be no state funding for any political parties. Second clause, we will not limit the funding from any political parties as long as it's not from the state. The third clause, we will disallow donations to these political parties by anyone who is not a citizen and not eligible for that vote. And the final clause, because parties that represent the broadest base of people's views who can and do get the largest amount of funding in the event of elections. For example, we see the Christian Liberal Democratic Party in Germany and the New Democratic Party in Canada. These are 2 parties that get their funding from the people because they are best able to ensure a wide base of representation for the very public that they are campaigning for. First, the first speaker brought to us and told us about their policy. They said that there will only be state funding within their policy. What is the flaw within that? Because it's unfair to political parties who want to appeal to a larger portion of society. because it's then bad for representation, because people cannot support their parties to a greater degree, because it's interrupting the funding that all parties will be able to get under their paradigm. And then they told us that state funding will be equal for all parties. But that's fundamentally unfair, because some parties are larger and need to be able to spend more, because they have a larger voter base, because they have to go to certain other places to campaign, because they reach out to a larger group of people, they reach out to more groups within society. And it's fundamentally unfair to cut down the funding of these parties, given the fact that they represent more.
Madam.
Then they told us their justification for this under their policy was that large parties are bad. But we say that no, large parties have that incumbent advantage because they earned it, because they represent the people, and therefore it's justified to allow these parties to have more funds. It's justified to allow these large parties to exist because the fundamental principle of democracy is representation, and that is exactly what these large parties do. Then they told us in their first substantive that it's justified because it's a public.
Madam.
No, we say that in the US government, embroiled in a $14 trillion debt basis, and the European governments who are embroiled in the entire Eurozone crisis because of so much social spending, governments simply cannot afford this. What is their policy going to do? Because it's a public good, they're only going to let governments get deeper into the very debt because of the fact that they want funding for these parties. Because they want many small parties as well under the same substantive. But it's impossible to use state funds for every single one of these small parties, given the fact that governments have to care for everything else. They need to ensure that state funding goes back to hospitals. They need to ensure state funding goes back to schools and towards building of roads and infrastructure for the people. What happens when parties then only get a small amount of money from the state? It's moot at the end of the day because it's unable to contribute to the election process at all. Yes?
The tobacco lobby has continually insisted that smoking cigarettes doesn't cause lung cancer. Doesn't removing their influence means that we better protect the health of the people?
Sir, you are unable to be removed the influence even if you allow for state funding, because these tobacco lobbying groups want to protect their profit. They will still be existing anyway under their paradigm. What is the difference here? We're allowing for better representation, which is precisely the core of the second substantive, which I'm moving to anyway. Because they said governments pander to lobby groups, because big companies are richer than everyone else holding their corporate interests. We say no, the ordinary donor is still able to reach out to the public, and the ordinary donor is still able to reach out to the political party in the first place. But more than that, they brought us the example of Obama. We say Obama had more funds, and this directly rebuts to his POI because of the fact that Obama had more funds. He had $11 billion in terms of war chest because of the fact that he had support from the people, because he had a healthy number of immigrant supporters in there. And we say that this is conversely compared to the Republicans who were supported precisely by the National Rifle Association. But despite this, Obama still had the advantage because he represented the people. And that is the core logic which takes down his substantive and takes down his point of information. Finally, we say that large corporations have to do this anyway, and that even in the event that you get elected into parliament, you're equally going to have to negotiate with these large lobby groups. And it's better to ensure the public that at that point of election, you are able to do this. And in a position to allow for funding from these large lobby groups, so as to better forward the interests of the people and the views of the political party, so as to assure you that you're able to do this in parliament. So what is the yardstick for today's debate? We say that which side best allows for a freer and fairer democracy takes the debate. Exactly how are we going to achieve this? 4 points of substantive. Firstly, on how it distorts democracy and increases party accountability. My second speaker will forward on how there's a potential for governmental abuse under their paradigm and how it supports extremist parties. First substantive, on how it distorts democracy. The thesis of this argument is that it limits the democratic process of giving parties funding proportionate to the support base that they receive. Yes?
The reason why Obama had so much money was because he was funded by super PACs. If he were really so popular, why wouldn't people just vote for him?
Sir, Obama eventually did get into parliament because of the fact that he was voted for. Your democratic vote holds the decision at the end of the day, because an individual has to make that choice, irregardless of whether or not the party gets funded. Obama was voted in because the people supported him, and that tears that down in and of itself. Back to my substantive. Democracy must run its own course, because you want to leave the power within the vote of an individual, which calls for the support of the people, and leaving this choice towards the people. State funding hinders this. Why? Because parties with a small support base will still get the equal amount of funding that parties with a larger support base will under their paradigm. Under this idea, the state will therefore fund all parties, irregardless of their policy and their ideas. This is important because it allows the people, prevents the people they
What of
champion for,
information?
and therefore hinders representation. For example, the Pirate Party in Germany has only a small proportion of societal response, societal support, but even then, under their paradigm, they will still get the equal amount of vote as a Christian Democratic Party that champions the cause of everyone in Germany.
Madam.
Therefore, under our paradigm, it's much better because funding comes from the nation. It comes from the people who stand from these ideals for the party. When there's no state funding, it's allowing for it to be reflective of the best parties who are able to get into parliament, the best parties who are able to put out the best policies and therefore get the most funding. Precisely which was the 2011 campaign in the United States of America of the Democratic Party with Obama, with the war chest of $11 billion, despite the fact that the Republicans had large lobby groups such as the National Rifle Association standing behind them. It's because when you champion for the cause of the people, you're able to reach them and relate to them, and that is where I will give you your vote, and that is where I will donate to you, which is precisely what we stand for, allowing for the democratic process to continue to be upheld under our paradigm. Second substance, on how it decreases party accountability. The thesis of this argument is that with state funding, the party cannot be held in check by the people, which decreases accountability. Because what happens when you have a large amount of funding? You increase the incentive for irresponsible spending by your parties. Because these parties now have an overly large budget. Because the money is not from the people, you reduce the idea of them being accountable for the people. It's precisely what happened in Malaysia, where they took funding from the state, and therefore the Barisan National Party was able to allow for a concert, inviting Korean superstar Psy down for their supporters just before elections, just to attract young people. A few $1 million was spent on that campaign alone, and it was not for the purposes of reaching out, but it was the purposes for attracting last-minute votes. Therefore, with state funding, because you don't have to check, because with state funding, we remove the money that can be used for spending, allowing for water supplies towards rural areas in the country. Because it decreases the risk factor and need to ensure proper spending from the party by reducing that very check to the individuals with the vote who now no longer able to check on the government because of this reduction because of the provision of state funding. You're therefore decreasing the accountability. But if you have a small amount of funding, which their policy also forwards, there will be no difference because the election campaign will not be able to be contributed because there's too little money to every party. Conversely, under our paradigm, we're ensuring that parties can be held accountable by the people, which is important because it allows for the potential future, because parties could potentially be your very future government. So the side of the opposition is the one who understood, and we stand for representation. But more than that, we stand for effective governance, which is exactly why you should walk with us.
Let's clarify one thing before we move on to anything else. That every single political party under our policy is going to receive equal funding. And why? Because as Elvis stated, we need to correct a great injustice in the system right now. When you allow corporations and when you allow big parties to be visible over anyone else, there is no choice. There is imperfect knowledge of the options out there. And what democracy seeks to do is to always improve on the current system and refine your choice. So you can always make the best choice that is more representative of the people, so you can get a government which is more representative of the people. So let's look at 2 points of contention today. Who really makes a more representative system, and secondly, on the whole idea of who actually better allows for the spending of money. Let's look at the first point of contention. Who actually allows for a more representative system? The main thrust of their entire case is that funding of the people means more support. That means they're essentially directing, votes proportionately to your funding. And we think this is really strange, and it's a complete assertion. They haven't really proven to us why one vote means a certain amount of funding, and more votes mean more funding. Let's take this argument down in a few cases. Firstly, you can show your support through other ways besides funding. So your right to show support for political parties is still in place. We think it's better because instead of simply spending money, you can perhaps contribute to the political discourse. You can talk about why these policies really represent everyone in society and get enforcement those kinds of means, which are so much more important to ensuring that people get the political knowledge than we need, than simply money. Because we can't really tell anything from money. Actually, we can tell one thing from money: who's rich and who's poor. And here's the problem: because you increase class discrimination that is going to take place amongst the entire society. Because then the richer people and the richer communities have institutions that can back up those kinds of political parties, what about the disenfranchised? What about those parties
who don't have that kind of revenue, then we don't think that they can even stand for any cause. We don't think they can get the visibility to defend their interests, even though their voices also need to be heard. In fact, in my substantive, I'll prove to you why they don't even enter the political arena in the first place. But moving on from that, we don't think, the whole idea of corporations, they don't have a right to decide whether they want to have a political option, because corporations don't represent the individual who is vulnerable and needs to be taken care by the government. We think corporations don't therefore constitute a right to donate their own funds. Before I move on, yes ma'am.
Under your paradigm, precisely as your first speaker's policy stands, large parties would only be allowed to have the same funding as small parties, which constitute only a minority within society. Do you know that?
Wait, isn't there a contradiction? You just said that bigger parties only seem to cater to a certain minority, when you said that actually their entire voter base is supposed to be the largest, and that's why they need more funding. No, we don't think so. We think precisely because of the fact that the voter bases are already so big, they already have a key advantage over those who don't, because their entire voter base might tend to donate more money. Rather, we think that these parties should try to differentiate themselves and attract people all around the country by ensuring that their policies are different enough and not relying on funding. But more on that later. So once again, they haven't proven to us the entire idea of why we get rid of the corporate lobbyists, right? Why we rob them of their voice, why we allow other people with other interests who are more aligned to public interest to have a voice. Because we think these corporations only are profit motivated. They care about things like polluting the environment at the expense of everyone else, like promoting the propagation of guns. And we therefore think that it's a misalignment that needs to be corrected. Let's look at the second point, the whole idea about who makes best use of the money. The first thing they said was the whole idea about debt. Oh, please, ladies and gentlemen, every single argument they give to us about opportunity cost, about ensuring that we can spend some other dollar somewhere else is going to be irrelevant, because they need to prove to us why the opportunity cost is so bad in the first place, especially when they already considered to us that lots of these big parties don't have accountable spending. So we don't think the money that they're already spending is going to be used in good places anyway. Then they tell us that you're going to be less accountable under our policy because you have limited funds, and that's why people will get side down to your country. But we think it's going to be much worse on their side, because they have no accountability whatsoever, because the state doesn't fund any money. So they don't have, for example, the legitimacy of the state. You don't have things such as being able, you can actually just use the money for whatever you want, just to cater to a specific demographic who is only the only benefactor of that money, instead of reaching out to every single person, maximizing your money so you can actually maximize your outreach. And that's what's going to happen on our side. Before I move on, yes sir. No? Okay, sorry. Moving on to my substantive, which is how we better increase political engagement. The first thing I'm going to talk about is how we actually allow these kinds of parties to differentiate themselves through policies. Because we think it's far more convenient for these people to secure funding from simply the richest number of people. That means people from other classes are going to be disenfranchised in the sense that they don't have enough say in that party, because the party can ignore them because of the fact that they won't get enough funding from these kinds of people. And the second thing I want to talk about is the whole idea about disenfranchised groups. And here's the problem. There are many groups that are disenfranchised because there are not enough political parties in the political arena to represent and defend their interests. We give the example, like the voting rate of Hispanics is 31% lower than whites in the South, and yet they still form the second largest racial demographic. And here's the problem. Because of the fact that these kinds of political parties that will represent the minorities don't start up, because they find it hard to start up, precisely because it's so expensive. Because, I'll take you in a moment, these communities don't have the financial institutions that specifically cater to them. You have things like the Native American Navajo people having their land and property being encroached upon by developers who want to build condominiums and casinos. Before I move on, yes ma'am.
But sir, under your paradigm, when many parties are existing and only able to get a small amount of funding, how are you going to help them anyway?
Once again, we think that the state, as always has stated, has the most resources and the most capability to actually provide for anyone. Even if it has less funding and perhaps not as showy a campaign, we think it's still better because it's better representative of everyone. We rather lots of small campaigns than a gigantic one which reaches out to everybody but doesn't actually represent lots of people who fall within the gaps and are ignored. That's the purpose of democracy. representation for everyone. Moving on. So even if these kinds of parties could stand up, we don't think they have enough funds to sustain the cost that will actually incur through running a very visible campaign. You can't compete with the Republicans who can push for, to build a $400 million bridge just to sway the swing voters in Arkansas, for example. So when the people see that, no political party can actually represent them because they don't want to start up because it's so expensive, they will think it's meaningless to vote and exercise the right not to vote. We think that the state therefore loses its legitimacy over time because certain people aren't giving them their mandate, yet they think that they still can craft policies for them and for the benefit of them, which we think is going against what the political process is supposed to provide. So how does state funding actually alleviate this problem? We give people an incentive and guarantee that they'll be able to sustain a campaign. Therefore, they'll start a political party because we remove the initial barrier, which means that disenfranchised minorities will actually get represented. And secondly, we think you're using a state as a mechanism to include a group which has been vulnerable and which has been ostracized against. So we're correcting a wrong in the state, in the eyes of these kinds of people. They realize they now have the legitimate backing of the state and they will therefore have an incentive to be politically involved in a country that has ostracized them. This is why we say that we represent more.
Ladies and gentlemen, the one problematic assumption on side proposition is that they assume that politics is only a game where the rich have all the money and the poor have nothing. They assume that only interest groups control the political field and the vast majority of people can do nothing. In my speech, I'm going to break that assumption, and with that, the rest of their case. So let's look at this debate through two main points of clash. First, which policy best allows the greatest representation of views? Second, which policy best aligns the party's incentives with the people's incentives? So let's look at the first area of clash, about representation. What they told us, first of all, was that what happens now is that with more votes, a party doesn't necessarily get more funding because of the interest of things like interest groups. So we're going to tell you this. Funding as well as votes are both perfectly legitimate means of expressing your support for a particular political party. We say that people should have the right to express their support for these parties through funding, because it is funding that enables a party to run, not just enables a person to express a wish for this or that political party to get into power. No, thank you. And that is why interest groups and corporations which give funding to political parties have this funding to give for a reason. It's because people rally behind these interest groups which protect different sectors of society, which protect different interests, which are very legitimate and very important. Which leads us to the next area of clash, when they told us that rich causes tend to get more money than poor causes. No, we disagree. If people don't vote for you, even if you're a very rich person, you still will not be able to influence in the end. You still will not be able to exert that great an influence over whether a party gets into parliament or not. And we find it extremely demeaning for them to tell us that ordinary citizens can never support their party, no thank you, by getting adequate amounts of funding. Because the real world works like this. There is no rich cause versus poor cause in the real world. Rich interest groups like the NRA, like the National Union of Teachers, have enough funding to give their political parties because a lot of people donate money to them. A lot of people support the causes that they uphold, and it is perfectly legitimate that these people be allowed to give funding to the parties they want to. Ultimately, the funding comes from the people. For us, that's what matters. That allows parties to run, and their side denies democracy. But what about parties like minority parties and causes which they say don't have enough money some of the time? We tell you that it's quite false, no thank you, that these causes don't always have enough money. That's why, as my first speaker told you, Barack Obama, while supporting LGBT rights, while supporting the rights of Hispanics, while supporting the rights of new immigrants, all of which go against their portrayal of what rich people usually like, was able to campaign in the 2012 election, no thank you, with an $11 billion war chest. Because people from the LGBT community and the Hispanic community rallied behind Barack Obama and supported him with funding, it is wrong to say that groups which support civil liberties and which support freedom don't have enough money. The truth is, they do. The next point they told us in their second speaker's first substantive was that minority parties can't start up. Sure, on their side, state funding might allow minority parties to start one or two branches in a small city. But state funding will never allow minority parties to make their issues big, to make their issues, no thank you, heard on the national stage. And this is precisely what minority parties need. If not, they forever stay a minority party. And how do they get sufficient funding to do this? Not when their side bans any funding other than state funding, but when minority parties can get support from wealthier members of their community. That's why communities like the Cuban Americans and the Asian Americans are able to make their issues heard in Parliament, because these parties give a lot of funding to parties like the Democrat Party and the Republican Party, who respectively represent their interests in Congress. That is how minority parties better gain support. They told us then that they want to equalize the playing field and remove the incumbent advantage. Well, thank you. As we've already told you in our first speaker and throughout our speeches, this incumbent advantage is earned, and that is why it is wrong of the government to interfere in the political process and decide for itself that all parties should be brought back to square one, and that's why we say their policy is undemocratic. Let's move on to the second point of clash, about aligning party and public interest. They told us that government funding makes parties more accountable. No, the government should not be the one checking the finances of parties, because this gives a huge propensity for abuse, for the government in power to say, I'm sorry, you're violating tax laws, so I'm going to cut off some of your funding. It should be the donors of these parties which check funding to them, and that is why it is our policy that promotes accountability. No, thank you. Next, they told us that corporations tend to skew political incentives. No, we say that often what happens is that corporations keep others in check. That's why for every oil corporation which donates to the United States government, there is also the IPAC which donates to the government in support of American Jewish interests and gets the government to look out for these interests as well. So that argument false. Let me look at my substantives now. First, I'm going to tell you, hold on a minute, sir, how it is their side that creates great potential for government abuse. Why? Because the power of the state to control party funding allows it to stifle and prevent opposition. Yes.
Some benign corporations and some civil liberties groups might get an airtime, but it doesn't mean that corporations still deserve to have a greater voice than the people.
First of all, sir, the main donors to political parties aren't always corporations. Corporations can always influence the government in other ways, like outside the party process. The main donors to these parties are civil liberties groups. Under your side, these groups will never be able to get very much airtime, because the amount of funding they get from the state, as my first speaker brought up, is so minuscule. Moving on to my policy, to my substantive. The problem today is that what happens is that the state can control the funding that is given to the opposition. In developing countries, which they've ignored, but which the vast majority of this debate takes place in, the state will simply deny funding to opposition parties because the rule of law is weak in all these places. But let's look at the next part of my substantive, of what happens in developed countries. It is still very dangerous, thank you both of you, to give funding, to allow the state to control funding in these cases, because there are just so many legal regulations the state can exploit to stifle opposition. Just look at what the Democrat Party is doing now in Congress by getting the IRS to harass conservative think tanks. That in itself shows that there are so many legal regulations the state can use. Just look at how the Republicans and the Democrats in power, in a state with democratic checks and with the Supreme Court, frequently gerrymander districts to their advantage, even though supposedly independent electoral commissions exist. Giving funding and the control of funding to the state gives the state power to arbitrarily cut off or remove funding to political parties, thank you, as and when it likes, especially because they have no other sources of funding under their model. The solution then is to enable political funding to come directly from the people who support these parties rather than the people in power. This removes an even more insidious and even greater incumbent advantage which their side gives to the parties in power, and more than that, prevents the government from distorting democracy. No thank you, that is why our policy is democratic. Moving on to my next point of substantive, about how their side strengthens extreme parties. Before I move on, yes.
Why would the Democrats want to weather this backlash when nearly half the electorate is clearly conservative but will rally against whatever exploitation you spoke of?
Sir, the point is that even if Barack Obama doesn't always want to weather this backlash, sometimes junior members in his parties do it, and look at what's happening right now. That clearly shows you that parties have an incentive to manipulate their positions of power to help themselves. I'm going to show you how their side strengthens extreme parties. Why? Because state funding allows parties with radical and extreme agendas to stay in parliament much longer. From time to time, parties with really extreme agendas pop up, but because their vote share is transitory, they don't always get to stay in parliament that long. But the problem with their side is that they allow these parties to cover their running costs and stay in parliament, therefore legitimizing these parties. In the Netherlands, where state funding was given to extreme parties, politicians like Geert Wilders rulers who supported the banning of the Quran were able to become kingmakers in the Dutch parliament, and this clearly harms democracy. What then is the solution? The solution is to allow these parties to slowly die out over time when their vote share dies as well, by denying the funding of the state to them, allowing their short lifespan to run its course and stop them from getting into parliament. That's why groups like the British National Party, who were once in the news, were saying they would shoot immigrants with shotguns, are no longer in the news and no longer get into parliament anymore. Ladies and gentlemen, because it is our policy that best protects democracy, we beg you, side opposition.
I'm going to examine the two fundamental tenets of democracy. First, that of which side better allows for more representative government, and secondly, which side produces a more accountable government. On to the first point of contention, which side better ensures representation? And here we'd like to point out that our analysis has always been nuanced from the very start. We're not saying that political parties will be able to gain seats in government just by funding alone. What we're saying is that we acknowledge that some parties might have legitimate causes and they are able to address the interests of voters sufficiently. But the effect of corporate dollars on their side makes it far easier for them to sidestep the need to cater to voters' interests, and in this regard, they disadvantage smaller parties with less funding but who are able to be more representative of the population. With that framework in mind, let's examine what exactly they told us today. They told us that it's unfair and unrepresentative that large parties receive only the same amount of funding on our side of the house. And our answer is simple, that if large parties rise to power because they are able to better cater to the interests of the people, then under our side, with equal funding, the advantage will not be eroded. They too are still going to be voted into government. So there's no net loss on our side of the house. But contrary, we think that if these parties only rise to power because of the entrenched advantage they get when money places them in a favorable position, then we think this is bad and we reject this. Consequently, we think that when smaller parties are better able to cater to these interests, but are able to do so just because they have less money, it's far better on our side of the house when these parties now have the benefit of state funding and you neutralize and equalize the playing field such that they're able to compete on the same grounds. Then they told us that they're limiting the outreach of large parties. And here we'd like to point out that this is very specific to large parties. This isn't the case for small parties who are so heavily disadvantaged that they could really do with the few dollars of state funding on our side of the house. But even if this is the case, we don't think it's an absolute right for large parties to widen their outreach as far as possible. In the United States, we place limits on corporate funding. And the end outcome of this logic is that if there's a larger national objective, which then overrides the need for large parties to widen their outreach as far as possible, we think it's justified. And we think we've proven to you why this is justified, when we've proven that the sole basis of any democracy is when your parties are able to compete on the same ground. Competition is only meaningful if one party is not systemically and disproportionately advantaged over the other, because in that instance, competition becomes meaningless. Then they told us, they repeated the line that your parties earn this incumbent advantage. We agree. And if this is the case, we think they'll be able to replicate this incumbent advantage on our side with equal funding anyway. But to the point where incumbent advantage distorts democracy, we reject this and we think the solution is state funding. Let's examine the alternatives that side opposition has provided for us today. They told us about citizens funding. First of all, we think that most citizens are unlikely to feel so strongly for a cause that they're ever going to donate in the very first place. And the end outcome of this argument is that corporation spending is always going to far outweigh and override any sort of dollars you get from the citizens. Ultimately, it's still corporate interests which are best defended. So as a result, because citizens can never live up to the monetary might that corporations have, we think it's still systemically skewed against citizens in the very first place. But secondly, if they're standing for citizens funding, we think that this is essentially a semi-concession to our side's principle. Because when you provide state funding, the state is essentially taking monies from its own citizens to further a national objective in the first place. If they argue that citizens funding is what protects and better furthers democracy, we think our side does it too. And in fact, our side does it better because we provide it unequivocally to every single political party out there. So on that count, they too accept the very premise of our argument in the first place. No, thank you. But we're going to deal with the far larger glaring alternative which they have consistently tried to skirt in this debate, that of corporations. And here we're going to deepen the analysis. That first of all, under their side of the house, that in fact that political parties will want to pander to corporations simply because if they don't, they feel like they're being disadvantaged in relation to other parties which already do. But comparatively, when funding comes from the state, which is a far more neutral body that doesn't cater to a narrow class of interests, we think it's far more fair and you're ultimately going to serve the public good in the long run. In fact, we're going to argue that even if somehow corporate funding still exists, even though we've imposed a ban on all sides of the house, it's going to be far less. Why exactly is this the case? Let's examine the reason. Because when you have state funding, they're going to neutralize the effectiveness of corporate dollars. What this means is that even if corporations choose to fund, they're unlikely to fund as much because they recognize it's a limiting factor regarding the effectiveness of those corporate dollars anyway. So even on the part of corporations, we diminish their incentive to massively pump dollars into the system. Before I go on, yes sir.
On your side, these problems do not occur in a much smaller degree because on your side, corporations still control huge tax revenues, can still pull out and cause the government to lose huge amounts of jobs. Tell me why that doesn't give them disproportionate political influence.
So first of all, we think our side comparatively neutralizes it better because the sole outcome of any, because the sole determinant of an election result is by how well your political parties campaign. Even if corporations are able to control other advantages out there, at least you preserve the integrity of the democratic system. But secondly, given that your side already blows up the problem and tells us that corporations have so much advantage over the system, why is your side making it any worse for them to allow for them to enter the democratic system in the very first place? We think that even if our side doesn't solve it entirely, it's comparatively much better. Last of all, they told us that donations are legitimate means of expressing support, and our response has also been clear, that to the extent where you contributing some form of money distorts the basis of democratic framework, we reject this. Because the very reason why every citizen has the right to vote, regardless of how rich you are, is to ensure that it's not the rich who get their voices heard. So on that count, we result in greater representation. On to the second point of accountability. They told us in the second speaker that governments will stifle opposition. If the government is one which is going to use this mechanism of state funding to stifle opposition, we think even without the mechanism of state funding, they are going to do the same things, through gerrymandering or simply outlawing any forms of opposition parties anyway. They told us that now people will be unlikely to donate under our system. And here our second response is that in a system where your democratic institutions are so weak, your citizens are unable to see the true value of democracy, and citizens are unable to unlikely to ever really going to be contribute dollars to the campaign. What this means is that state funding is comparatively much better because we're not reliant on an entirely informed and engaged electorate, which doesn't always emerge in the case of nascent democracies. At least with state funding, we ensure that we better neutralize and equalize this playing field. But on their side, it's comparatively worse, this idea of stifling opposition. Because at least with the mechanism of state funding, it's far more explicit and obvious when the government is trying to systemically disadvantage opposition. On their side of the house, without the mechanism of state funding, states can resort to far more insidious tools of putting down opposition, which we think is even worse for their side of the house. But even in the specific case of such nascent democracies, today it's outside of the mechanism of state funding that better allows these smaller parties, which are crucial to democracy, to rise to the top. Then they told us in the second speaker that corporations can influence the state through other influences. Exactly because corporations have such a hugely distortive impact that we want them to tell us how exactly they're going to mitigate it. Last of all, they raised the point about extremists. We think this is a self-checking mechanism, that even with state funding, if your extremists are unable to cater to the large majority of the population, that your whole electorate is going to reject them, even with state funding, they're unlikely to be able to remain in the system. But on their side, it's far worse, because when you deny state funding to even radical groups, they're only going to go underground and become even more radical. They're only going to feel even more disillusioned by the system. They're only going to feel that the system has failed them. On that count, we've proven that outside results in greater accountability, greater representation. We are so proud to propose because we stand for what democracy really is about.
Four issues around which this debate centered. Let's ask ourselves two very simple questions. And the first one is this: does money grow on trees? Unfortunately, in reality, the answer is no. And that is something that the proposition was never actually able to understand. Because when countries such as Greece are riddled with debt as high as 170% of their GDP, we really don't understand where all the money which they wanted to fund both their big parties and smaller parties like Golden Dawn was going to come from. Throughout the line, we never heard any response to this practical issue in and of itself. But let's look at the second one. Are corporations really monolithic entities? And this is something I'll explain later on as well. But let's look at it first. They fail to recognize that at the end of the day, corporations and interest groups are made up of people, rich and poor, who band together for their own causes. They are not contributing money for the sake of it, but rather because we all believe in a certain cause. They come from different strata within your society. And that is the reason why they are an interest group in the first place. And in any case, having money doesn't buy them votes. No. So with those two assumptions settled, let's move on to the two main ideas in today's debate. Firstly, what exactly is democracy? And secondly, which side best aligns party and private incentive? Let's move on to the first one, on what is democracy. We brought you on our side, in the opposition, that democracy is built around two things, representation and accountability. No. Let's look at the first one on representation. Here's where we need to break the fundamental assumption, as we've already done, that money buys you votes, whether directly or indirectly, as their third speaker wanted to tell us. Let's look at the base question. Where does this funding come from in the first place? There are two different groups of people it can come from. No, thank you. Firstly, it's individuals whom they didn't really want to deal with at all, because they failed to recognize that as long as an individual feels for a certain party and he wants to support a certain party, he should be able to contribute funding to that party as well, through things such as donation, through things of purchase such as your campaign merchandise. Many things like these are things that individuals already do in the status quo because they feel the need to support that party before it goes to the elections process. Those are things which they never dealt with on the side of the proposition. They fail to recognize that these individuals have the choice to make the decision to support these parties by doing other things so that they can have more campaigning, so that they can reach out to more people across your society. Those are all things which the side of the proposition never dealt with. So let's look at the second one, which they wanted to base their entire case on. No thank you. Then on corporations. Why did they tell us that corporations and lobby groups have massive amounts of power over everyone else in your society, including your political parties? Is this really true? We don't think so at all, and we've given you numerous reasons for this, that they are built around people and their interests, and we gave you examples, such as the American Civil Liberties Union. And in any case, the corporations on the side of the proposition would have massive amounts of power too. Even worse, because on the side of the proposition, since they have so much tax revenue, these corporations, what they will be able to do is simply pull out of countries and take the jobs with them. They were never able to address this on the side of the proposition either. So now let's look at their substantive political engagement. No, thank you, man. They told us that poor people won't have a say, there will be disenfranchised groups in society, and that nobody cares about them. This is a very doomsday and apocalyptic scenario which they painted on the side of the proposition. But does this really happen? Because the only logic that they were able to bring to us is that you make it cheaper for a party to start up, therefore you have more minority parties. But is this even good in the first place? What they fail to recognize is when you have more minority parties, if they are only catering towards a minority in your society, they won't be voted in anyway, regardless of whether you have state funding or you have private funding. There was an issue which we already brought to you in our first figure that they were never able to deal with. But even then, if we assume that these minority parties get elected in the first place, what then happens? Since they form such a small group within your parliament, they only have 1 to 2 seats. Can they actually achieve anything? The answer at the end of the day is a straightforward no. And the reason for it is this. If they are going to be a minority party within parliament, the likelihood of them being able to raise their issues in the first place is close to zero, because there are many other pressing national issues on the table to be discussed in the first place. I'll take you in a moment, sir. What then happens? When you have a big party which is able to cater to these minority groups in the first place, since they now have a majority of the seats within parliament, when these minority issues come to the forefront, they will be able to actually push for change to happen and make sure that you can actually have change for these minority groups within your society. Something that the small parties which they want on the side of the proposition would never be able to. But before I move on, yes.
So you're telling me that just because small parties might not have the capability to do so, we should deny any form of representation? Because we
no, sir, we're not saying that we deny them any form of representation whatsoever. But what we're saying is that big parties already have a natural incentive to make sure that they cater towards these minorities in the first place. Because they recognize that there are going to be a certain number of people within your society who will always vote for them, and a certain number who will always vote against them. Therefore, all the other groups within your society, the minority and smaller groups, will form the swing vote. And the natural incentive is for these big parties to make sure that they can capture the swing vote. And the way they do so is by catering to minority interests in the first place. And that's how you actually get the minority interest up there into parliament and you achieve concrete change. Something which wouldn't happen on the side of the proposition. No, thank you, ma'am. They didn't brought to us this issue of accountability. And this is where they completely dropped my second speaker's analysis on party accountability. Something they never wanted to touch. And it still stands strong on our side. So let's move on to the second issue, of which side best aligns party and private incentive. No, thank you, ma'am. The first issue that they told us was about government control. Well, government control actually happens a lot easier on the side of the proposition. And the reason for it is this, that when you have state funding and virtually no other funding whatsoever, it means that now all these parties are dependent only on money from the state. And the state can make all kinds of arbitrary criteria for when will they give you funding, when will they take away funding. And this is especially pertinent in many nascent democracies. No, thank you, sir. Because all that the side of the proposition wanted to do was to focus on the best democracy in the world and the most perfect democracies. But what they failed to recognize was that there are many countries across the world which simply don't have that great systems in the first place. And in those systems, it's a lot worse if you ban any form of private funding whatsoever. When you make these parties completely dependent on state funding, what happens is you eventually go to a one-party system where you have no opposition whatsoever, and we don't really see how representation is going to happen on that side either. No, thank you, madam. And that's where we brought to you this idea of party accountability. That we rather these parties be responsible and accountable directly to the people who support them, the people who contribute funding. Be they big interest groups or individuals who contribute their own funding in the first place. When these individuals are contributing funding, if they see that their parties aren't representing their interests, they not only take away their vote, but they take away the funding as well. And this is something which keeps these parties on their toes all the time, to make sure that they are always accurately representing the interests of the people, to make sure that they are always doing the best possible, to make sure that these issues are not only represented, but they achieve concrete change on it. Something which the side of the proposition never wanted to have. All they stood for at the end of the day was to say, we want people to talk about things, but at the end of the day, they wouldn't achieve anything. So let's look at the last one, on extremist parties. Something which we raised in our second speaker as well, that they didn't have a very concrete response to as well. They said that the vote will reject these people anyway. Well, if they don't think that these people should be in parliament, then why fund them in the first place? We told you already, that is going to be a massive waste of taxpayers' money. We told you that this is not the kind of thing which your state should be supporting in the first place. All lines of argument and key analysis which the side of the proposition missed and never wanted to deal with. At the end of the day, we brought to you 4 main lines of argument. We told you that number 1, it's best for democracy. Number 2, we ensure more party accountability. We prevent the support of extremist parties, and we prevent government abuse. All key lines of analysis on the side of the opposition that weren't concretely responded to on the proposition. Because the side of the opposition was the one that actually understood that democracy isn't about representation that's equal for everybody, but about representation that's the best possible to actually achieve concrete change and efficient policy making at the same time. We recognize that democracy isn't about equal representation all the time, but rather it's about efficiency and making sure you can do what's best for your country. As for all those reasons, that we were more than proud to stand on the opposition.
At the end of the day, what happened inside proposition was just like what would happen if you only allowed political parties to take state funding. They would be static, they would never be able to evolve, and they would never be able to adequately represent the interests of their people. So I'm going to break this debate down into 2 very simple issues. First, which side best ensures democratic equity? Second, which side best aligns public and private incentives? Let's look at the first issue of democratic equity. The central question both sides of the House faced here was how to ensure that everyone in society had an equal and proportionate amount of influence. What are the lines we heard from side proposition? The entire first speaker's speech basically boiled down to one simple thing. The rich are bad and they do bad things in politics. What we told you in our first opposition speaker was that first, the rich should have the right to donate their money to political parties and causes if they so choose to. Because it's not necessarily the case, and not a systemic problem as we told you, that the rich only support bad policies. But our response went deeper than that, because we told you that no matter how much the rich donate to politics, they will never be able to buy off the votes of the huge amount of people who really feel that certain policies advantage or disadvantage them. No real response from their side, except for a repetition in their second speaker that the rich are like the big bad wolf in politics. So in our second opposition speaker, we deepen this attack by showing you that there is no such thing as rich causes and poor causes in politics. What we told you is that there are a spectrum of actors who fight for a spectrum of causes. There are corporations who fight for their corporate interests, that we admit, but there are also civil causes. And we told you that the people who run civil causes are not necessarily poor, because people care about civil causes. Ordinary people, as well as wealthy people within communities affected by these causes, donate a lot of money and give a lot of resources to parties who champion these civil causes. Without these resources, we told you, they would never be able to champion these causes in the first place. That's why the ACLU and groups like the ACLU and the LGBT community and Asian Americans enabled Barack Obama to win the 2012 election with a war chest bigger than any of that of his opponents, despite the fact that he doesn't support the kind of corporate riding roughshod over the environment that they wanted to tell you about, despite the fact that he stands for legislation on gun control. That was an example and analysis they were never able to respond to throughout their three speakers. What then do we hear from their third speaker? She only wanted to talk about corporations and completely ignored the analysis we brought to you about how it is civil causes and the ordinary citizens who are wealthy but care about democracy that back them. So what we told you was this: the same harm exists on their side because the influence of corporations will always be disproportionate in an economy. They control tax revenue and they control jobs, and so we have to find other means of limiting this influence that lie outside the scope of this debate. But what we also told you throughout our second and third speakers was that corporations, because they have naturally competing incentives, tend to keep each other in check as well. That's why for every corporation who tells the US president support the Arab nations and the oil lobby, there is another corporation, or the IPAC, who tells American presidents support the Israelis in their fight against the Arabs. All this was analysis unresponded to throughout their side. So on the second point of pressure on which this debate coalesced, on public policy and public and private incentives, what we told you was that government is not purely about representation. It is also about efficiency, but in any case, it is our side that ensures both equity and efficient representation. Two main points here. First, they talked to us about minority parties. What we told you was that with government funding, minority parties will never be able to get their issues to the national stage. They will never be able to tell the vast majority of people about what's happening to these minorities and make these issues well known on the national stage because government funding is so minuscule. And then we told you about how it is their policy which incentivizes government abuse. Because governments, even in the developed world, always gerrymander. Governments, even in the developed world, always find excuses to get the IRS to chase their opponents. And that is why giving control, in fact, sole control under their side of party funding to governments is a very, very dangerous thing. Because democracy should not be decided by government dollars. I am proud to oppose.
If you trade state funding for corporate funding, and if you trade political parties that support corporations and not the people, you will end up with a government that passes policies at the expense of the people. In their world, at every single election cycle, the very same parties and the very same faces appear every single time. Because their incumbent advantage has been entrenched every single time. Because all the same corporations fund the same parties. You deprive people of a choice to vote for better parties. In their world, when the poor man goes to the government for food, they only give him the $2 a day because they are beholden to Wall Street bankers who insist to both parties that you can't raise taxes. You can't raise taxes to help the poor man who really needs food to be put on the table. In their world, the economy will become worse because the president and the Attorney General will never dare to hold Wall Street bankers accountable for the terrible things they did during the 2008 economic crisis. All these things will happen in their world. And in their world, when newer parties with younger members and better policies want to assemble, they can't, because advertising is simply way too expensive. Campaigning is way too expensive. All these smaller parties with more valuable discourse points will not be funded by large corporations, because corporations only believe in the power of large parties that in turn protect their interests. This was the fundamental problem with their side. Where corporations decide to fund a party, it isn't because the party protects the interests of everyone. It's because they protect minority, top-level interests. A few assumptions govern their world today. First of all down the line, they strongly asserted by first and second speaker that the support a political party get is often equivalent to the financial power that political parties get. We think this is blatantly untrue. But beyond that, they insisted a lot of financial power came from individual donations and interest groups that really protect people's wills. Let's deal with this one by one, because all my speakers have given you responses they never dealt with. The real donors are the same few people, Wall Street bankers or Israeli Jews who really want the Americans to protect them. Clearly, ACLU isn't as rich as the other bankers, because look, recently we just found out that NSA began spying on people ever since the year 2000. Clearly they aren't as rich. The problem is, when you find out that people are funding these parties, you entrench them in power. In a democracy, you're not supposed to entrench certain parties in power and deny other people the choice, when choice is so fundamental within a democracy. If this was repeated consistently by my second and third speaker, their side never once dealt with. Then they talk to us about how citizens also donate. But clearly, very few citizens see political causes that they are so passionate about that they're willing to take out, say, $1,000 to donate to a political party. It simply doesn't happen. But beyond that, even if a citizen were to donate, this was the key analysis for my third speaker, even if you were to donate, this funding will never ever outweigh the enormous funding that all of the large corporations on Wall Street give to you. And that is why corporations in the status quo, in their world, will always be more powerful than the individual causes that our side want to protect. Having dealt with all this logic, they didn't deal with it, but they retreated to talk about how there were a lack of funds. Lazy responses like there were a lack of funds in many countries. Like we elect extremist parties, like minority representation will never happen anyway. Clearly no. If the government bans extremist parties, then no, they won't be allowed to run anyway. We think we better leave it to the country to deal with all of these problems because our side isn't in a position to judge on the electoral climate within the country. But beyond that, if the government really is going to exploit or oppress opposition parties, they don't need to resort from siphoning away electoral funds away from them. We don't think we're talking about any viable democracy if the parties really want to do that. At least our side gives people and gives minorities the power to start parties because we recognize that money is power. We recognize that at the end of the day, our side wants to give them a voice in parliament. Not the most strong voice, but at least they might be kingmakers or at least they have their voices heard in political discourse. Their side never dealt with this. Our side protects interests of the people and our side protects democracy.
Okay, the judges were certainly agreed that this was, on the whole, a good debate and a very close debate. I think when we were discussing, some of us were saying that even heading into the reply speeches, we weren't quite sure which way it was going to go. And it was little things that were clarified and really nailed down right at the end that perhaps swung the debate the way it did. And certainly more than one judge ultimately gave this by just a half-point margin. It was that close. It was a good debate, well engaged. In the end, we were unanimously agreed that one team had a very slight edge, but it was indeed a very slight edge. So what were the key issues in this debate? Early on, we had, I think, coming initially from the opposition, the whole opportunity cost argument. You know, to some extent, states will not be able to afford to do this, or it will indeed impinge on other key things the state needs to do. This was a sort of little argument that was brought up, responded to a little bit, but not, more or less dismissed rather than really tackled by the proposition. But it never really became a key issue in the debate later on. There were a couple of other issues in the debate that also came up, didn't end up becoming the major area of focus, but did have some influence. One of these was the whole idea of extremist parties, that is this going to be ultimately something that is going to lead to extremist parties getting a foot in a way that isn't reasonable, or is in fact better to allow them in and at least have a reasonable playing field. And we had some arguments coming in about the whole idea of, is it going to be distorting the field? Are governments going to be, in fact, use this as ways to try and suppress opposition by putting in petty rules that in fact make it difficult to work properly in certain particularly emerging democracies? Or is, in fact, at least in showing that this particular area is regulated, creating a fairer system, even though there may be other ways for it to be distorted? These were issues that came into the debate. We didn't necessarily feel that one team or the other really got the better of these issues, and they didn't ultimately become the really critical focus. I think there were two major areas that kept coming up again and again over the speakers, which we did ultimately feel one team just got the edge on, which probably really turned this debate. The first was this whole idea of corporations. Corporations having a disproportionate influence on the political scene through the way that they are giving particularly large amounts of money to certain parties, or is it in fact the case that, ultimately this all cancels each other out? There are interest groups which counter particular lobbies, and in the end it in fact leads to a more level playing field and more attention being brought to these issues. This is what one team said, this is what the other team said. Interesting, good analysis from both teams. In the end, we did feel one team had a slight edge, but it wasn't by much. Also, the other major issue that came up was this whole idea of representation. is in fact a system where, at the moment, where parties are getting funding from various sources, but sometimes disproportionately from certain sources, mean that certain small interest parties that do represent legitimate areas of society are being particularly stifled, and is this particularly unfair? Or, in fact, is it the case that once parties become very broad and take funding from a number of areas, you have larger parties out there that are still catering to various different interest groups within perhaps a wider coalition, and because they are large parties, are able to use that influence to enact the kind of change that we maybe don't see small parties who are only ever going to take a small foothold being able to do. These were the really key issues which we did in the end feel one team was just a little bit more consistent of its analysis of right through the end and had a slight edge. But it was only a slight edge, it was a good debate. I'll tell you first who we thought was the best individual speaker of the debate, and that was the second speaker of the opposition. And the winning team in a very close but unanimous decision, and the team that will be going on to the semi-finals, is the team from Anglo-Chinese.